Okay. Hobbes' Leviathan is one of the landmark works in social theory. It was published during the English Civil War in 1651, and Hobbes is running scared. Life is precarious and uncertain. Violence is ubiquitous, and Hobbes thinks that he has thought a way through the greatest of life's dangers and wants to inform people that much of what they believe and the patterns of their thought are mistaken. If you want to get to know Hobbes, and I still do, one of the best ways is to go to the National Portrait Gallery in London. The portrait of Hobbes is, if I remember correctly, on the top floor, and it's a disturbing image. It's a tad sinister. The background is black, and Hobbes' black clothing merges into it, so you can't see where the background is and the clothing begins, except for a white lace collar. Apart from that, all you can see is Hobbes's face and head. So it's a portrait of a forehead for the most part, because he's balding, and a hand. So in other words, Hobbes intends to be practical, theoretical, and black, with all the uncertainties and sinister implications of that. Now, Hobbes created the first English translation of Thucydides. And for those of you who have read the Greeks and you know who Thucydides is, you know what that means. Thucydides is the original power politician. He gives us the realpolitik of the Melian dialogue and also the civil war at Corcyra. And it turns out that big fish eat little fish, and it's time to grow up and face that. The fact that Hobbes thinks, of all the ancient works I could translate, what Anglophones really need is a copy of Thucydides, tells you a lot if you are sufficiently well read to know what is within Thucydides. What he's going to argue for is a kind of enlightened absolutism. He lives during some of the critical and terrifying transformations of the 17th century. He was born in 1588 at the time of the Spanish Armada, and he died in 1679. So he has a long and rather, how can I put it, tendentious life. Almost nobody agreed with Hobbes. There was a bitter civil war going on, and neither side liked it. And I'll try and explain why, and why Hobbes is in many respects correct, but this is often not information that we will willingly or gladly receive. He argues in the Leviathan for a kind of enlightened absolutism. In other words, he's going to argue that the best government is the most powerful government, because the alternative to government is anarchy and chaos. It's what he calls the war of all against all. And as he says, under those circumstances, which is natural to human beings in their pre-political state, human life is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. So he says, look, the human condition, here's one of Hobbes's hard claims. The human condition is binary. There are two alternatives. There's bad, which is having a government because it's oppressive and onerous. And there's worse, which is not having a government. So what that means is, if you have a government, stick with it. You have no right to rebellion, no matter what they do. On the other hand, if you don't have a government, keep your head down and maybe you'll live to see tomorrow. Both Machiavelli and Hobbes are political realists in the sense that they don't try and shoehorn ethics into politics, or perhaps they do it by modifying the traditional conceptions of right and wrong. Hobbes doesn't have a summum bonum, a greatest good. Instead, he has a summum malum, a greatest evil, and that's being dead. So he said, if your political theory or your political activities result in you being dead, that's called a failure in politics. If, on the other hand, you get from one day to another, That's what we mean by being successful. So Hobbes is like Machiavelli with the heroism subtracted. In other words, Hobbes is a much more plebeian survivalist mentality. Both of them try and view human activity and politics through a human's eye view. But Machiavelli is still caught up with the idea of a heroic savior for Italy, where Hobbes says that's just going to get you killed. That's really stupid. Why would you care whether Italy or any place else is unified? As long as you survive until tomorrow, that's successful politics. So it's an anti-heroic politics. All right. And he has a decidedly bleak view of human nature. Without government, society breaks down into individual atoms, and it's the war of all against all. Everybody kills everybody else for their property or for their sense of honor, their sense of arrogance and pride. And that's what makes life so solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He was also, and this is worth thinking about, well acquainted with the intellectual activities and the main intellectual figures of his time. He wrote, and this will be important when we look at Leviathan, he wrote a response to Descartes, and particularly attacked his dualism as not making any sense. And there's a lot to be said for that. The problems with Cartesian dualism, or any kind of dualism, even the kind we get from Chalmers nowadays, is very difficult to bridge that gap. On the other hand, he also was Francis Bacon's secretary, which means that he knows about the experimental method. He visited Galileo when he was on the continent traveling. And what that means, and one way of thinking about it, is the great Enlightenment thinkers. Here I'm talking about Descartes and Bacon and Galileo, Hobbes and Locke, and a number of others. They're intellectual mutants, they're intellectual mutations. And I mean that literally, not just figuratively. And this is an unusual kind of, or set of mutations, because it turns out they're adaptive mutations. Remember that in the natural world, most mutations, like the albino deer, get killed almost immediately. Most mutations are maladaptive. But the Enlightenment is a small handful of men, many of whom know each other. And not only do they know each other and know of each other, but they extend a similar set of intellectual mutations. Part of it is a this worldly view of human affairs, which corresponds to the human perspective in, say, astronomy that we get with Galileo, or with perspective as we get in the Italian Renaissance, paintings of the Renaissance, or politics as we get with Machiavelli back in the Renaissance. All right, so Hobbes is an intellectual mutant. And he's quite vigorous, and he writes in a way that he thinks will offer us a permanent understanding of politics. In other words, he has the same final attitude towards his writing that Descartes had with regard to his. Okay, now he's going to be the first to introduce a couple of new and important ideas. The first of these important ideas is the social contract. This is hugely important. It gets mentioned, in passing, actually in Plato's Republic, because everything's in Plato's Republic. But it is not a popular idea in the ancient or in the medieval world. The reason why is because in the ancient and medieval world, politics was seen as being a top-down affair. In other words, legitimacy comes from God or the form of the good, or in the case of, say, the Aeneid, the gods choose Rome to rule the world, and then Rome rules all the subsidiary inferior peoples. But the idea is that it's a top-down understanding of political legitimacy. And this is connected to a medieval idea called the Great Chain of Being. God has constructed the world as a series of hierarchical niches. He's, of course, always at top, but below him is the legitimate government, or legitimate monarch, or legitimate legislature, whatever they are, and below them are the different strata of society, and below human beings are animals and plants, and all the way down, it's a top-down hierarchy. If you want to see this in action, take a look at Dante's Divine Comedy. All three parts are arranged in this hierarchical schema. And the reason why is because that's the way medievals thought about the world. Now, the social contract is going to be a big change, because in this case, this is a real earthquake, legitimacy is going to come from the bottom up. You're going to have natural man, natural man, natural man in the state of nature, where life is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. They're all going to lay down their clubs at the same time, step back, and make somebody, whoever it is, the sovereign. And that sovereign now has life or death power over everyone, because they've agreed to give up their mutual capacity for destruction and create legitimate politics. Now, one of the strange things here is that he doesn't see human beings as naturally forming families. So he has atomized what used to be the molecule, the minimum size, the minimum unit of politics that we saw in Aristotle's politics, the family. He's broken that up into its constituent pieces. So what we get is the focus on the individual rather than families. And it seems that individuals are natural, families are not. I'll come back to that later on. But the key thing here is that once you have a social contract and legitimacy comes from the bottom up, that means that people in the bottom stratum who are not the sovereign, now, because it's a contractual relationship, both sides get something. For the first time, Hobbes has to introduce a new idea. It's called rights. In other words, since this is a contractual relationship and the sovereign guarantees people's security so they can't be killed arbitrarily, they have the ability to demand things of the government that they couldn't before. Try and think of Plato's Republic and imagine the bronze people demanding anything of the gold people. They would say, that's absolutely out of line. You don't make demands on us. We'll tell you what you can have. Same sort of thing with Aristotle's politics, right? Slaves don't have any rights that they can demand of masters or of great-souled men who are involved in politics and living a great life. Same sort of thing with Rome. Yes, they had the idea of citizenship, and that allowed for rights, but or that allowed for demands. But this was a contingent set of possibilities because you didn't intrinsically get Roman citizenship. It was a gift. Same sort of thing with serfs. There was no practical way for a serf to demand anything of his lord. If times were bad and there was a famine, he couldn't say, look, you owe me breakfast, because legitimacy was from the top down. And if the Lord says no, then you starve. So the point is this: social contractarianism is going to introduce a new idea. It's called rights. And this turns out to be a very fruitful, very important idea. All right. Now, Hobbes's Leviathan, it's a big fat book. Generally, people focus on the first two parts. The last two parts are often not read, but I'll talk briefly about them so I can save you, 300 or 400 pages, which might be better spent otherwise. The first part is called Of Man. This is his theory of human nature. And he explicitly says, human beings are mechanisms. In other words, there's no soul stuff that makes them free and gives them free will. In fact, we're mechanisms, we're machines, but we're badly programmed machines. So we harm ourselves because our programming is defective, right? What he's doing is responding to the end of Descartes' discourse on method, where Descartes says, well, all living things are machines, which is why sheep are woolly mechanisms, right? Their heart is a mechanism, the lung is a mechanism, the liver is a mechanism. But people are different from that because they have freedom and they have the logos. And Hobbes says, look, don't be stupid. That makes no sense. There's no way you're ever going to be able to salvage dualism. So he's going to be mechanical all the way down. So the problem that he's trying to address is the fact that we're mechanisms that have been programmed, here you could insert the word educated, in a way that causes us to harm ourselves. So he's going to give us a better kind of programming, which will allow us to avoid the worst possible calamity, which is the war of all against all. Okay, so humans are badly programmed machines, and what it means to be alive is to move. In other words, you'll notice that when people die, they stop moving. And when they're in motion, they're always in motion towards what is pleasurable and away from what is painful. So they operate like amoebas, right, avoiding light. And what we want to avoid is death. That's just intrinsic to human nature. And the worst thing that can happen to you is to die. So you want to create a set of arrangements which reduce, because you can't abolish the inevitability of death, but reduce the immediate likelihood of violent death. And that's a pretty minimal thing to expect of politics, but for most people, most of the time, keeping the peace is a wise decision. So he takes this as his goal. It's his summum malum. And the way he's going to show us that the social contract is intrinsic to human nature is by arguing that fear is more powerful than pride. In the state of nature, it's the war of all against all. And of course, every once in a while, you find a big Achilles-like fellow who can beat anyone in combat. And sometimes he beats them in order to take what's theirs. Like if they've been fishing, he wants the fish, he kills them and takes their fish. If he wants sex, he rapes women. If he wants anything else, he takes what he wants. Now, Hobbes points out that even Achilles has to go to sleep. And when people are sleeping, as is inevitable, even the weakest person can kill them because no one's going to be protecting them. It's the war of all against all. So even great warriors, great heroes have reason to fear violent death. What this means is that we're going to have to find a way of overthrowing pride, and we're going to need to use some more powerful emotion, and that emotion is fear. In other words, Hobbes is taking fear as the thing that makes civilization possible. So fear is his friend. Fear is a good thing because it's the only thing stronger than pride. And remember that Leviathan in the book of Job is king of the proud. So what he's doing is creating an artificial king of the proud through the social contract. And this king of the proud, if it's properly constituted, will be so formidable and so fearsome that everyone is going to recoil back, and they're going to decide not to break the law, because if they do, the sovereign will kill them. All right. So fear overcomes pride. And for Hobbes, that's a good thing. That's our only possible way out. But what this means is that the government has to be as fearful and as fearsome as is humanly possible. So there can't be any, distribution of powers. There can't be any checks and balances, because insofar as you weaken the government, you make it less fearsome and less formidable, and you invite a fall back into the universal civil war of all against all, which is the worst possible thing. So for Hobbes, there are only two conditions. There's bad and there's worse. And what he's trying to persuade people is that whatever government you live under, admittedly, it's bad because people don't like to be controlled. They're naturally proud, but it's better than being forced into a condition of permanent absolute fear. So Hobbes says our binary condition is such that we'll choose what's slightly worse, what's slightly better than the absolute worst thing. And that's the best you can hope for. All right. His discussion of the human body is all mechanical, as in pulleys, springs. His psychology is purely mechanistic. It's based on pleasure and pain. We move in the direction of pleasant things. We move away from painful things. So it's a very primitive, rather oversimplified psychology, but there's a certain element of truth in it. And from this view of human nature, he manages to build a commonwealth. What he means, this is the second section. The telos of the commonwealth is to establish peace, which is not natural to people, which only exists in the condition of people that have left the state of nature through the social contract. Now, Hobbes also allows that legitimate governments can come from conquest, not just the social contract. Because if one army invades from one territory, invades a second territory, if they destroy that government and subjugate that land, then the contract between the group of people that have been conquered and their sovereign, who's now dead, is null and void, because the contract is that the sovereign's going to protect their lives and their lives. Since he no longer protects their lives, they have the right to give up on their relationship to the first sovereign and accept the invader as sovereign. Right? So that means that there are two sources of legitimate rule. One is conquest and the other is the social contract. Now you may wonder why he brought the social contract in at all. Here's why. In order for an army to organize itself into ranks and a general and soldiers and those that give orders and those that take orders, they must have had a social contract at some time, because even if they were created by some other conquest, going back, you get an infinite regress. At some point, you're going to have people agreeing to cooperate and work together and take orders. And that means there has to have been a social contract sometime. Right? Otherwise, you would never have had any human cooperation. Armies would be impossible and conquest would be impossible. So Hobbes picks up from Aristotle the idea of the one, the few, and the many. So there are three kinds of regime, but unlike Aristotle, there's no bad form of these regimes. Hobbes says, look, the idea that there's a bad form of monarchy or aristocracy or democracy is just the complaints of people who have been forced by the government to do stuff they don't want to do. He says, look, the point of having a government is to make people do stuff they don't want to do. And if it didn't, then it would be the equivalent of not having government at all. So nobody wants to pay taxes, but we pay taxes because the government will punish us and harm us if we don't pay our taxes. All right. We may complain that taxes are too high, but that's not for us to judge. That's the sovereign's decision. And whatever rate the sovereign sets is the rate you pay. Unless you want to be a renegade, and then you're the enemy of all, and then anyone can legitimately kill you because you violated the social contract. So he says, look, we have put together some bad terms for certain kinds of rule by the one, the few, and the many, but those are just malcontents who haven't thought the political situation through properly. And in fact, we just got the one, the few, and the many. And he thinks that monarchy, the one, is the most practically useful, but he allows that there can be a legitimate government from a social contract that leave government to the few or to the many. He just thinks that a single man or a single woman ruling a state is the most efficient and best organized, most stable sort of government. So we have a binary alternative between bad and worse. And this is a deeply morose philosophy. You can see why he melds into the black background in his own portrait. All right. This is true political minimalism. And we want the government to have the absolute maximum power that it can, because every decrease in the government's power by creating, say, a set of reserved rights beyond the absolute minimum necessary, like, say, the US Bill of Rights or the French rights of man and citizen, what that does is limit the strength of the government. And that means it'll be easier for rebels to make their move to destroy the current regime. And what that does is throw us back into the state of nature. And that's the war of all against all. And eventually people will get tired of the terrors of the state of nature and they'll start another government and begin the exact same cycle again. So what Hobbes is saying is, look, there's just bad and worse. So it's a mistake to try and get rid of or disobey whatever regime you happen to have, because what that does is just going to throw you back to a worse situation. And then after much misery and death, you're going to end up creating the same thing all over again. So there is a sort of logical coherence to this. If you accept the premises, Hobbes's ideas do follow, and he makes a lot of good sense. The only right that the individual is allowed to keep in outside the state of nature, that's in the state of government, is the right to self-preservation. So that means if the sovereign decides that he's going to execute you for whatever reason, legal or not, that you have the right to fight against the sovereign soldiers because the sovereign has broken the social contract which guarantees you the right to self-preservation. Of course, the sovereign has an army and there's only one of you, so you're going to get killed. But at least everybody else doesn't have to go back to the state of nature. Now, this is an interesting idea because Hobbes thinks that since we're mechanisms, we can't help but look to self-preservation. In other words, we don't have the capacity not to care whether we live or die. Think of it this way. Imagine the sovereign tells all of his subjects that they have to pay 10% of their wealth next Monday. Okay, well, the sovereign can do that. Suppose the sovereign says that everyone is going to be conscripted into the army next Monday. Well, he can do that. But suppose the sovereign says everyone must hold their breath until next Monday. Well, the problem is they can't do that. It's such, human nature is such that we can't suffocate ourselves on command. Why? Well, try it and you'll find that you can't hold your breath until next Monday. So Hobbes is giving you the absolute minimum of rights that can be allotted to the people that are ruled, right? It's a little bit like saying you have the right to move slower than the speed of light. Well, okay, since I can't move faster than the speed of light, that sounds like a very plausible idea to me. Yeah, it's another thing that you should notice. I guess Hobbes didn't have this at his time, but if the sovereign orders you to move at the speed of light, you can properly say, I'm sorry, but I'm not that quick. You see the kind of rights that Hobbes gives. It's a very, very small area. It's just the domain of self-preservation. And the idea of rights is going to expand in subsequent generations. But for now, this is the absolute minimum that you can allow. You can't avoid this because human nature is such, we're machines, we can't self-destruct. All right. Hobbes' sovereign is above the law. So he doesn't rule within the law. He's not a constitutional monarch. He is an absolute monarch. If there were laws constraining him, then the sovereign would be correspondingly weaker. And the result would be that this would tend towards disorder and eventually civil war, and eventually we get thrown back into the state of nature. So the safest, most stable kind of government is the rule of one person that is absolute. Think of something like the history of French absolutism, right? What is it? Louis XIV said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. Well, that's what Hobbes has in mind, not the kind of constitutional monarchy that is going to emerge after the English Civil War, right? Cromwell dies, and then they create a restrained monarchy that allows for parliamentary supremacy and the division of powers. Hobbes would say, look, that's not going to work. But Hobbes is a very extreme thinker. And what he wants to do is show us that we're naturally inclined to be alive rather than dead. And the best way to do that, the most effective way, is not to allow for a right of rebellion, not to be able to call any regime tyrannical, not to be able to delegitimize any regime because it did you some harm. If it didn't kill you, the regime is legitimate. This is what we agreed to in the state of nature. All right. The third and fourth parts are not perhaps so important for contemporary political thought. The third is on the Christian commonwealth. Like Descartes, I think that Hobbes has a kind of attenuated religiosity bordering on atheism. And, when I was younger and read Hobbes, this seemed straightforwardly atheistic, and I could see how that would be. On the other hand, he may still take seriously the idea of something like a prime mover. So he does his best to grind through scripture and find the right way of thinking about a Christian commonwealth. And he gets rid of papal authority, but the sovereign is only secure and only properly constructed if he has absolute control over religion as well. Now, remember that during the English Civil War, when this is published, the fight was between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers were Anglicans, the Roundheads were Puritans. The Puritans were an extreme Protestant sect. The Cavaliers were a less extreme sect that had more connection to the Catholic tradition. Each side said that God was on our side and God will allow us to win. Hobbes says, no, let me explain it to you properly. You don't win because God is on your side. God is on your side because you win. And Hobbes says, look, I don't care which of you win, just win now, win soon, win immediately. And then once you win, you can tell us all the great stuff about what God likes and doesn't like. It'll turn out that God really likes you and doesn't like the people that were destroyed. And that's just fine, because that's the way in which religion is properly organized, entirely under the domain of the state. And what this does is pull the religious justification out from under both the Puritans and the Roundheads, right? He says, look, you don't win because God favors you. God favors you because you are the winners. So like Machiavelli, it's or like the old Oakland Raiders, his theme is just win, baby. That's what it's about. Once you win, then we can work out all this other stuff about theology. But the point is to win, and that means violence. And whoever is the most violent and succeeds in creating and destroying their opponents creates a government, and then everything, including and perhaps especially religion, is now going to be under their thumb. Finally, there's a fourth section called the kingdom of darkness, which is not, he doesn't believe in heaven and hell, which again is rather strange if you want to view this as connected directly to Christianity. But what he means by darkness is ignorance or deception, particularly self-deception. And he is very concerned about religious enthusiasm. He looks at Calvin, he looks at Luther, he looks at Zwingli, he looks at Cromwell, and he says, people who think that God talks to them directly and that they're taking orders from the Almighty are extremely dangerous people. People who claim that they've seen miracles or caused miracles are also dangerous because there's no way we can know that. So what he wants to do is to force people away from religious illumination, direct religious illumination, because he thinks that's a kind of self-deception, and it's a dangerous self-deception. So what Hobbes is giving us is power politics. And it's worth considering that while most governments that exist now do not have a Hobbesian regime, which claims to have absolute power. I guess maybe North Korea does, but there are very few regimes that claim domestically that the only alternative for us is the war of all against all. On the other hand, if you think about it, international politics is desperately Hobbesian. In other words, you are in the war of all against all there. We create cobwebs called international law. But as Stalin once asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? And since he has no divisions, his opinion is not relevant. If you look at something like the invasion of the Ukraine, yeah, I'm sure that international law prohibits that. And what are you going to do? Well, we can, try and support the people that are displaced and harmed by this, but it's the law of the jungle in international politics, and big fish eat little fish. If you look at, say, the American hegemony over Latin America, or if you look at Chinese domination of East Asia, where they're claiming to control everything out to the first line of islands, which means not just the South China Sea, but also the Philippines and Japan and Indonesia, you can see, and the Chinese will be directly open about it. I mean, they sound like Thucydides. They say, look, we're a big power, you're a small power, and the Americans aren't going to help you. So the fact of the matter is, international politics is red in tooth and claw. And while we have tried with things like the League of Nations and the United Nations to create a workable kind of social contract between nations, which is something Kant demands and Woodrow Wilson tried to create, the problem is the big powerful nations are not going to allow anything that greatly diminishes their power, because as a matter of practical fact, the US or China are not really the equivalent of any of the fly specks in Polynesia, right? Maybe they both have equal rights to a seat at the UN, but that doesn't make them equally powerful players. On the other hand, weak states, small states like Luxembourg, are not going to allow for a League of Nations in which the military inequality and the economic inequality of the world is not just legitimated, but made permanent by a system of arrangements which gives special powers to, or which gives special consideration to the big powers. De facto, that's what they did in the Security Council, all right, which is made up of the big players, or it used to be the big players. I don't know if England and France still are, but China and Russia and the US are. The key thing here, though, is that Hobbes is right, at least about international affairs right now. If you break your word or break a promise in international affairs, you can take people to the International Criminal Court, but only if they are part of small nations that can't stop you, right? No Russian general is going to be brought to the ICC. No American is going to be brought. No resident of China will be brought. But smaller states it applies to, which is, well, a very dubious and incomplete kind of justice. That's the best you can say for it. Now, I want to look just at a couple of problems with Hobbes. When you get sworn in to give testimony in a court of law, they ask you, they tell you to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This is Hobbes's problem. Hobbes is telling you the truth, but it's not the whole truth. People are hostile and they are violent, but that's not exclusively what they are. For example, parents very rarely kill their infants. They may be unaware that in the state of nature, the war of all against all requires that husbands kill wives and both kill their children. In fact, they don't, because human beings are sociable, but Hobbes doesn't allow for that in his account of human nature and his account of the pre-political state. So he's not telling us the whole truth, and that's important. Hobbes's idea that we are self-interested and there are limits to what the government can do to us, even if these limits are very small, is actually a fruitful one. It'll be developed later on. For example, in the American founding, when the Fifth Amendment is written, allowing people a right not to incriminate themselves, this is essentially drawn from Hobbes, because if you're someone that's on trial for a capital offense and you are required by law to give testimony against yourself, you are not able, or you cannot be expected to enable and make possible your own death. So the right not to incriminate oneself is essentially a Hobbesian holdover. And of course, all the men who put together the American Constitution were well versed in Hobbes and well versed in the Anglophone intellectual political tradition, and they also knew French, and they also knew a number of other classical writers. But Hobbes looms very large there. And the most important thing that Hobbes does is by introducing the idea of a social contract, he destroys the earlier idea of the great chain of being. Since Hobbes, it has been less and less common for governments to make reference to their legitimacy on the basis of the will of God, right? I think they still do that probably in Vatican City, maybe in Iran, but there are very few, and maybe in Saudi Arabia as well, but there are very few such constructions now. In fact, most governments claim to represent the will of the people and the consent of the governed, and that's all tribute to the social contract. Hobbes is a very important figure. He will well repay your study, and he is clearly in the line that we have from Descartes last week to Locke next week.